Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is John Lingan, author of A Song for Everyone, the story of Creedence Clearwater Revival, released by Hachette. John's first book was Someplace, a southern town, a country legend, and the last days of a mountaintop honky-tonk. John has written for the New York Times Magazine, Smithsonian, the Washington Post, and as many other venues. So, August 16th, 1969, half past midnight, I was sitting or laying semi-comatose in Bethel, New York. CCR was coming on stage. Do I remember their performance? Well, you know what they say, if you remember Woodstock, you were not there. I do remember a pharmaceutical ball of opium the size of the core of a golf ball. I remember on May 15th, 1970, the Spectrum, long gone in Philadelphia. After getting kicked out of prep school for the second time, calling in sick at my job at Philco Ford assembling picture tubes, a job I had gotten from my buddy Alan Paymer, who was killed the next week in a motorcycle accident in London. So CCR was a really good concert, sandwiched in between last week's The Doors and next week's Jethro Tull. So that was two other sick calls. But since they made me join the union, they couldn't fire me, even though I was like the worst employee there. So I'm intimately familiar with a band whose records are now nestled in one of the boxes in my garage with my other 399 records. And there is Willie and the Poor Boys. Somewhat the worse for wear. But all of this occurred about a third of a century before John was born. But John has brought those memories back to me and more. He gives us the origin story of a group that I found so amazing and original and that shaped my teenage years and did so as well for a whole nation. So thanks, John, for joining us today.
It wasn't quite a third of a century, but yeah, it was a little bit before my time. And I had, you just surprised me with your bona fides there. So it's great to be talking to a true head, sounds like.
Yeah. If my parents knew that I was going to Woodstock, they never would have let me go.
That's why my mom wasn't allowed to go. Parents put the kibosh on it. So
they wouldn't let my brother go, which he always resented me for. Took my 66 Chrysler Newport up there. It was big enough to hold 8 people in the trunk, which I did. So why don't we, here, let's start with the origin with the caveat that I've always thought of CCR as John Fogerty and nothing and nobody else.
Sure. Oh, you're not alone there. I mean, I think first of all, we can start at the present day. You know, he's out touring, playing a lot of the songs that he wrote and recorded with the band. And he, no longer refers to them as Creedence Clearwater Revival songs. He refers to them as John Fogerty songs. So, I think that kind of animosity that took place over the last 50 years since the band broke up, especially for someone like me who, again, discovered them or learned about them well after they were broken up. It's kind of interesting to go back and remind yourself and learn that they were not only, a full group, but, a very tightly knit group. John Fogerty's brother was there. They knew the other guys since they were young teenagers. That sound that they developed took 10 or more years to develop together before they ever became famous. So yeah, certainly one of the kind of driving forces for me, or the thing that got me interested in writing this book, was learning some of that back history and learning that there were 3 other people, and that they all sort of played different roles, and that that famous angst that they all seem to have for so long after breaking up, trying to determine, to what level it was readable and visible while they were still together. That was a major part of me wanting to write this book.
Yeah, not only is John out touring and doing little promo videos from time to time, but I just read that article in the New Yorker, I guess it was in August, that basically said, hey, how come they were so unappreciated, but now they're becoming appreciated, and going through like, let me see what she says. Um, she talks about uh, emotion and how it equates to, you know, the rushing to the treadmill and kind of like things are going today. She talks about Tombstone Shadow, presaging the Great Resignation,
Hmm.
and and she talks about, oh yeah, the new documentary Traveling Band, but it's going to be narrated by Jeff Bridges coming out.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so before we go any further, what do you attribute? Well, you're like an early adoptee. What do you attribute this new generation, like my kids and my grandkids, not my grandkids, but my stepdaughter who's 14, she knows them.
Mhm.
And of course, even though John didn't like it, you know, a lot of these songs have been on commercials that he would have rather not seen or heard.
I think, I mean, it is absolutely true between, I guess, this book and the fact that there's this documentary that is sort of, another biographical kind of treatment of the group, but it is also sort of based around their famous concert in the Royal Albert Hall in 1969 or 1970, excuse me. And they, so these sort of things together, and then their performance at Woodstock was semi recently, like in the last couple years, released as a CD. So yeah, there is a little bit of a revival, as people have written about. But I also think, to some extent, this is one of those bands that never really went away. I can't remember a time when I was growing up listening to classic rock radio stations, or even going to sports games and that kind of stuff, when there wasn't like some Creedence Clearwater Revival being played somewhere. That's doubly true if you think about movies and soundtracks for, stories having to do with Vietnam in the 60s and that kind of thing. They're sort of omnipresent there. Um, in terms of why that is, you know, there are so many reasons to it. I think even, the book that I wrote is called A Song for Everyone. That's taken from one of Fogerty's compositions, but it also sort of shows, it's meant to underline the fact that when they were famous, when they were big, their audience really cut across all these different social strata at a time when, at least my understanding is that, those lines between people were growing ever thicker all the time. People were finding their tribe and going for it, and things were, very, very contentious. And yet, in that moment, Credence was able to be, uh, are not only celebrated but sort of taken in as one of their own, to working class people, to black people, to by white people, um, civil rights minded people, feminists. They all sort of found something there. And the same has sort of continued to be true musically, even since they broke up. I mean, there is a Creedence Clearwater Revival sample on the Beastie Boys' License to Ill from 1986, which was the first hip hop album to ever go to #1. And there was, talk about Creedence Clearwater Revival by members of Sonic Youth and Nirvana around the early 90s as a sort of like key influence in terms of their guitar tones and the sort of like, for lack of a better term, the grunginess of their sound. Now when you think about sort of Great American Songbook in the country tradition, I think a lot of country artists think of a song like Lodi, or Have You Ever Seen the Rain? I mean, that almost feels like sort of proto-Americana right now. So to me, I do think that they are having a certain bit of a moment, perhaps because of these new releases related to them. But they're also one of these bands that's always just sort of been in the firmament, almost easy to take for granted for that reason, because they are sort of like, oh yeah, that's the band with 20 songs on the radio, and you hear John Fogerty center field at the ball game, and it's like we all know they're good. But that's why the sort of particulars, the specifics about their career and how they achieved it, were so fascinating to me, because they were almost like the furniture, to me, in terms of, music from that era, culture from that era.
Yeah, the other thing, I mean, everything you say, I'm writing down these questions because there's so many things. I'm old enough that I'll forget them if I don't write them down.
Sure.
But one of the things that's interesting is that, when you hear any of them interviewed, they're not really that interesting, especially John. It's kind of very straightforward. He's got his shirt and he sits there and he answers questions. But and that goes back to like Bill Graham and the fact that, they were called the Boy Scouts, I guess, of the Fillmore. They didn't do drugs, they didn't do drinks. And with regard to the feminism aspect of it, is that they never really sang songs about girls or having sex with girls or having drugs. The only song I can think of, I guess, is towards the end, is Sweet Hitchhiker. And that's not even close. So there were so many, and then on top of that, you're talking about this equation, this conception of them as this, not even Southern, almost this band from the Bayou, just like their song. Yeah. And that was just a persona. You talk a little bit about in the book about how John adopted that persona when he wasn't anything like it. That's why he admired Tony Joe White so much.
Yeah, the Southern thing, and you're absolutely right. It's not just Southern, but it's very specifically the Bayou thing, the like Louisiana thing. It's really fascinating because there is no part of him, if you read all the many interviews that he did at the time and since, if you read his memoir that came out in 2015 or so, there's no sense of him that he really cared about the Bayou, like as like a place, or like that was somehow like held some really high importance to him. If you ask, when he spoke about the song Born on the Bayou, he spoke about being influenced by a movie called Swamp Fever, which I looked up, and Swamp Fever was, I believe, an early movie from the early 50s. It was a black and white film, and it did take place in a swamp. It was a kind of like, thriller of a kind. And it certainly seems like the kind of movie he would have seen as a child, or maybe even on television, perhaps in syndication or something. But it also didn't take place in the Louisiana Bayou. The actual story of the movie takes place in Florida, which again, that's not to knock him. It wasn't like he was acting like it was like he was reporting on a real thing. But to me, it's just like, that's just, he was informed by so many different sort of cultural inputs in my sense of things. And so like, he, just like he said he was influenced to write Bad Moon Rising by the movie of The Devil and Daniel Webster, he was inspired to write this other song by another movie. And, he heard, songs about like wolves and all this other stuff by Howlin' Wolf. And he heard, so like he sort of absorbed, like I said, all this cultural iconography from different places. And I don't believe that the Bayou in and of itself was a particularly important place to him. I think it was just like one more place that he could use to bring atmosphere to his songs. And the atmosphere of the songs was like Southern. And I think like to some extent, he came by it honestly, because he listened to that music. He listened to, swampy and urban R&B on the San Francisco area radio stations when he was growing up in El Cerrito, California. So did the other members of Creedence. He heard it alongside a lot, country music. He heard it alongside early rock and roll. Many of whose artists were Southern themselves. So yeah, I don't mean to claim that he was authentically Southern in the way that we use that term, but it's like he just sort of like he as someone who was very serious about making music from about age 12 or 13, mid late 50s, 1957, 1958, he over the next few years really had a chance to authentically, I think, experience and absorb a lot of different kinds of music and culture. A lot of it's Southern, but not all of it. But that was certainly, I think, where the kind of like, the sort of the main arterial path sort of came back to him, was, back to the American South. And he was certainly not alone in that in songwriters, even at that time.
It's funny because you kind of imply it wasn't an autobiographical songwriting career, and other people feel the same way. But like, even if you look at this cover, which isn't in the South, you see these kids, these Black kids who gathered around just, by chance. And it really looks like, okay, this is down in New Orleans. I mean, and so I think in a sense, his life, his career is autobiographical, but almost, without getting too intellectual, almost in the meta sense that he had absorbed all this stuff and it came back out, never as a lie, never as a prevarication, but just this idea of what he envisioned as what an interesting person might be. And it resonated with him, whether you're talking about, for want of a better word, ripping off Little Richard, or take, and okay, well, let's stop now. Let's go into the management, because I realized he bought Little Richard's song, The Manager.
Well, he did not. Yeah, he did not. But yeah, I mean, I think it's
no, him, his manager, the company, Fantasy. But the point I was trying to make was that, as much as I admire John, and as much as I really think he did everything, and you're not going to dissuade me from that, he was a lousy businessman and a lousy guy to run the band. Too bad they didn't have someone else.
Yeah, I mean, they're as a band, they are definitely one of them. There's so many different places where you stop and you just think, what if, like, what if they had done this a little differently? What if they had done that a little differently? And I think certainly the decision by John to not only lead creatively, which is, I think, totally understandable and very well supported by his bandmates, from what I can tell. His decisions beyond that always lead to some level of mystification on behalf of those people around him. And it's not only just because, like, if he had been a great band manager, I don't think, it's like, that's one thing, but they ran into struggles, and he was, I think very few people are both, creative geniuses and business geniuses. Like, I don't think it's any knock on him to say that he wasn't the best at negotiating across the table from, tried and true experienced business managers, for sure.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that, here he is writing a song in 10 minutes. Here he is coming in at night covering his own vocals because he didn't want anyone else to do it. And, some people say he's a narcissist, a control freak, and all that. But if you take anyone who's a genius, from Elon Musk to Steve Jobs to Thomas Edison, they have to be kind of an asshole. Otherwise, they wouldn't get this shit done.
I wonder about that. I was just speaking, I was just interviewed this weekend about this book, and the person who was interviewing me is a friend of mine, and he made a similar point. And like, I do wonder about that, though. I mean, I think, like, we have enough examples of people who are kind, in addition to being so talented, that I don't know that those things are necessarily related I don't think that they necessarily have to go hand in hand. Now, I do think that, like, having spent some time around uh, musicians of that vintage, like guys from that era, and guys with careers of that length, um, there certainly is like there's a shared kind of like tunnel vision that does sort of that does sort of take place, that they do get, um, like when I spoke with Booker T. Jones at one point, and I was spending time with him for a couple of days for an article, and
That's
he's
cool.
a perfect example of, like, a guy who's like, his business is run by his wife and daughter, and he's the nicest person you could ever meet, and is just like, obviously, just like a fount of just like supportive good vibes to everyone who spends time around him. But his wife and his daughter were definitely like making fun of him, that like sometimes he's in like the Booker zone. It's like sometimes he just like doesn't have time for the people around him on a certain level. So that's like one level of this kind of stuff, that you do need a certain bit of that. But I don't know. Now, the other side of that is, I honestly didn't come out of this experience researching and talking to people. I came out of it with more sympathy for John than I might have even had going in. I think he was certainly a difficult guy to deal with, and he seems to be psychologically very complex, which I hope is like reflected in the book. With that said, he was not an abusive person in any way that I can tell, like verbally, physically or otherwise. He didn't treat women around him or other people with any kind of like, any kind of disdain or ill feeling or anything. It's just as we've seen over the last few years, and the lists of potential problems that like control freak awful men can have, I think he actually is just like, a difficult guy, rather than like a truly like a true terror in any stretch. And I think a lot of it, honestly, in terms of his reputation and everything, I think a lot of it has to do with just how young all of the people involved were when they were at the height and doing all of this stuff. All these sort of underlying, all the stories about how terrible he was, and all the ill feeling within the band and everything, all happened to people that were, between 15 and 23 years old. It's like we're talking about really, I don't know how great any of us look, if we're at the head of $1 million business, at that age, making all the decisions and trying to keep our head straight in the middle of it. I
Well,
don't know.
notwithstanding that, though, I mean, if you fast forward to 1993, and I mean, you relied on Stu and Doug a lot in this
Yeah.
book, but I still think of both of them as whiners. And also, I still think of both of them as being assholes. But like in 1993, when they were so pissed off that they didn't play on stage, who would you rather play with, Stu and Doug, or Bruce Springsteen and Robbie Robertson? It's a pretty easy call. I mean,
Well, I guess, but
and they're suing him at the time for something that he did for them, that without which they would be whatever they would be. They certainly would not have been rock stars, and they wouldn't have been making the money that they made. So it's the lawsuits that got me, but I admire him for a couple of things.
Mhm.
One, no encores, even though it sucks, which I remember, because everyone, I remember perfectly. And the second is that, he, now I forgot what it was. No encores and something else, but I can't remember what it was. And that he wouldn't sing his songs afterwards. I mean, that was pretty cool, because it was tough not to sing your own songs and then to get sued because your song sounded like your song.
You're a true blue fan if those are the two things that you admire him for, just because, like, and I'm not even disagreeing, but those are like, seem to be at least from what I've heard, two of the most just sort of like shoot yourself in the foot moves that he's had for a really long, in his career. That was just like, I mean, totally understand what you mean about like sort of having the courage of your convictions. But both of those are examples of like people wanting to hear your music and you saying no. And that just seems so strange to me as an impulse, for a creative person,
Yeah, I agree with that.
yeah. And like it's not up to me to litigate the the roles in the band, or who should be grateful to who, or who was worse to who, or who's an asshole or who's not. um it was to me, it's so many years ago, and if I were really interested in writing, I should just say I knew I didn't want to like write the book with that purpose of like settling the score, rendering final judgment on like whose fault is the Creedence blow up or whatever. Even though I think a lot of people, that's a very interesting story to them. It's like, how did this happen? And to me, I think you can understand all of that, the sort of underlying things, just by focusing on what happened up to the point of their breakup. Everything that came after that is kind of like either rehashing, revisiting, or just sort of like has its basis in that time period from when they were younger, and establishing those kinds of difficult relationships. I don't think a lot changed from like 1972 to now in terms of like their alliances or whatever. I think they were pretty much set by the time they broke up, in terms of like, you know, John was his own man, kind of apart from the rest. Stu and Doug, the bass player and drummer, were, obviously a pair unto themselves, were friends unto themselves, were a rhythm section unto themselves in that band. And then there was Tom, the rhythm guitar player, who had quit the band and left them a trio, and was always sort of the odd man out, but had more of a complicated relationship with John because he was his brother and because John was more difficult. So I see this as like an interesting group of, characters, subjects, more than I think of it as like, oh, who did what to who and how. I mean, obviously I needed to figure that part of it out, but like in terms of what, like whether I thought one of them was a jerk to the other, it's like, it didn't really matter to me.
Yeah, it doesn't matter to me either. What matters to me is basically the reason why I'm his champion is because it's like when they did Mardi Gras, and for whatever reason he goes, you guys can each write a third of the songs, and they did, and they sucked, and then they do Creedence Clearwater Revisited, and that sucks too. I mean, the idea is that no matter however you parse this, whoever's personality was challenging and whatever. What I'm simply saying is, and this is my pivotal point with regard to the book and you,
Sure.
is that I really don't see Creedence being Creedence without him, and I don't see Creedence being Creedence with Stu, Doug, and Tom. It's just a no-brainer to me.
I mean, I can't argue that. I think you're absolutely right as far as when you put it that way. I think I couldn't speak for them. My guess is that they would agree as well. You know what I mean? I don't think they were ever slow to give John his credit as a creative force, as a spectacular songwriter and singer. I mean, I think spending so much time listening to those guys reminisce and talk about that time period, I mean, there was a constant sense of awe of like, especially, because again, they went through a few different formats over the course of their years together. They went by a few different band names and even played a different kind of style. It wasn't until 1968 that they adopted the final name, Creedence Clearwater Revival. And that is also when their sort of final shape musically kind of came to be. And it was that great mix of like older blues music with, early rock and roll, a little bit of country and twang thrown in, and that sort of Southern Bayou thing. And especially once that began and John was able to tap into that, yeah, I think that they were astounded by every practice. He would come in with some new idea and some new catchy idea, and like even songs that they didn't think were that great still became insanely popular. I forget which. I think it was. I want to say it was Doug. Liked Bad Moon Rising, but didn't think it was like.
Yeah.
He was just like, okay, it's another John song, and then before you know it, that song's one of the most popular in the country, and but again, there were many other songs that they loved, and continue to love, and I think would not take credit for the writing of those songs. So I mean, I think you're absolutely right that you couldn't have the band or the sound or the songs without John. But in the same way, like, they wouldn't sound the exact way that they sounded if not for the other guys, and if not for, I mean, I truly do believe that. I truly do believe that, because especially because of the type of music they played. That type of music they played was so rhythm based that you have to give some credit to the rhythm section for building the arrangements, for finding those tunes. And if you listen to the live albums smoke. Those guys were an amazing live band, as so it's not like, as I think it's just a funny thing to me that there are any number, hundreds of examples of bands that have a single sort of creative driving force, a single lead singer, a single songwriter, whatever it might be. But in the case of Creedence, because of their own sort of internal, animosity and fights with each other that there's sort of bled out into public view, it does sort of make people go like, well, he was so much more talented than that guy, and he was so much more talented than this guy, and without him they never would have. It's like, but that's just true of a lot of bands. That's the case with a lot of bands.
Yeah, I agree.
And and I mean, whatever, who's to say? There were a lot of San Francisco area bands back then, and that like Stu and Doug were, and Tom Fogerty in particular, who was a few years older than them and was locally renowned as a singer before Creedence, or even their before the younger guys even met and started dinking around at the piano together. Tom Fogerty was already known to be like a talented singer. And so to say that none of those guys would have made music careers, like, to me, that's where I really push back, because again, like Stu and Doug and Tom played with Doug Somm. They played with Jerry Garcia and Merle Saunders. Like, they all played with many other great musicians after leaving Creedence. It wasn't like they lost John Fogerty and the sticks fell out of Doug's hands or something like that. Like, they were obviously very good musicians, and happened to be at the right place at the right time in San Francisco. So who knows what would have happened? But to me, I always thought that this band was more of a democracy than it gets credit for. Just because
getting away from all that, which we probably spent too much time on, I guess, but we would, because we're not on the same side. It's an argument.
Sure.
After doing this, I was thinking about this when I read the book. So you must, obviously you talk to those guys, you research the hell out of it, but I assume you listen to everything over and over again. I was just wondering, And, it's hard. This is like a Terry Gross question. What's your favorite album and what's your favorite song? Maybe you have one, maybe you don't. I don't know.
Oh yeah, I mean, I got a few. To me, I think that, well, yeah, to me, like probably the favorite album. I mean, we could just like, to me, the four albums, the three from 1969 plus Cosmos Factory in 1970 are all kind of like basically equal in the sense that they have like, each one of them has like three unbelievably great, just like killer songs, and a couple, some filler on all of them as well. So I like, but there are so many, like, in terms of like big hits, my favorite Creedence song has got to be Up Around the Bend. I just think Up Around the Bend, there is something about that opening riff that is just so powerful, and it's so inspiring, and it sounds so good. And it's also one of those songs that, like, especially in that chorus, when they are just like really hitting it, and there's like just a slightly more harmony on the vocals, it really does sound bigger than just four guys. It really
Yeah.
like, it sounds like there's so much going on in that song, and there's just such an incredible energy to it. So in terms of like, stuff you'd hear on the radio, I truly just think just embodies everything great about them. For less heralded songs, though, I do love that Bayou Country album, specifically for, I mean, Born on the Bayou is a great song. Bootleg is a phenomenal song. This like I mean, that is just like a really funky little Creedence tune that I don't think enough people know about. And its name is so funny that it's hard to even take it seriously. But the song "Keep on Chugglin" is just like
Oh
unbelievable.
yeah.
Yeah, and like the version on that record, to me, sounds like almost from the Velvet Underground, but it's the live in concert, the concert record that came out in 1980. The guitar solo and the harmonica solo towards the end of that by John are both just unreal, and some of the best stuff that they ever recorded.
What's funny is how you talk about, I never would have thought this ever, but now I understand it. Two bands that you talk about, and I thought, well, wait, where's the connection? Are Velvet Underground and Sly and the Family Stone.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know that I needed like, the Velvet Underground thing, to me, there's in this book, there are a number of sort of secondary characters almost that aren't even directly related to the band, but they kind of like show over the course of time, like how the band's influence sort of spread. Um, and the Velvet Underground is one of them, because the Velvet Underground were very similar to Creedence, and Lou Reed was very similar to John Fogerty in a lot of ways, in the sense of like primarily who their influences were, that early rock and roll stuff, that Bo Diddley and like R&B kind of stuff from the 50s. And obviously they took it in completely different directions by the mid 60s, and being in the Warhol milieu in Manhattan, introduced and opened up the Velvets to this wildly artistic, boundary pushing side, whereas like, Creedence were considered kind of buttoned up, old fashioned guys. But then you think about how, like, eventually over the next few years, even the Velvet Underground of all bands sort of, and I don't think this is because they saw Creedence and were like, we got to change the way we make music, but it was more sort of like, at the time that Creedence was so popular with their style, their sort of older, sort of simpler approach to music. You can see that a number of other bands, even the Velvet Underground, sort of came around to that style of music making, and like sort of became a little bit more R&B based, and became, sort of went back to those original influences that I think that they shared, until like an album like Loaded, some of that almost sounds like Creedence. It's the same kind of like it's the same kind of Chugolin rock and roll stuff.
Well, you take like Sweet Jane and rock and roll, and maybe a little slower pace. Yeah. But yeah, especially with rock and roll. And then Sly, some of the songs almost sound exactly the same, just from a different socioeconomic strata,
Well, yeah, well, they're one of those groups that I feel like never gets the proper hosannas they deserve. But yeah,
it cost me $6.50 to go to their concert. I thought that was a fortune. I couldn't believe they were
that is expensive. I've looked at a lot of concert posters over the last couple of years. That was expensive, but well spent, I would say. Yeah, they were both Bay Area groups, East Bay Area groups. Sly and the Family Stone were from Oakland, and Sly Stone himself was, again, sort of like John, a child prodigy musician who worked, I think his first group was called, like, I know that the Grateful Dead were originally known as the Warlocks, but I think he might have even had a similarly named band at some point. But he was also like a session musician and, a live performing, sort of musician for hire, before ever founding that band and becoming involved in the Fillmore scene and getting way into drugs and all that kind of stuff. And they performed together a lot, famously at Woodstock, of course, but also at the Fillmore East and West. And yeah, to me, they were very similar, in the sense of like, just sort of like the country and the city versions of a similar idea, very sort of like communal songs, widely appealing to a lot of different kinds of people and different groups. Just one group dressed in flannel, and the other was, Dayglow Afro'd party people. It was pick your flavor, I guess.
Yeah, it's funny too. When you talk about influences, where John had his bromance was with Tony Joe White.
Yeah, definitely.
But he was the real thing. It wasn't a persona. That was just him. What did he say? If I had your face and my brains.
Yeah, it was this weird line that was like I think it was in 1971. So like at this point, John has been the most, the head of the most famous rock band for like 2 years in the world. And they took Tony Joe White on tour. And at that point, I guess Tony Joe White still only had like the one real like hit song, which was Polk Salad Annie. And John just like loved this song, was just like obsessed with Polk Salad Annie. And yeah, he said to Tony Joe White, if we were like combined and had like your looks and my talent, we'd be the biggest star in the world, which is just like such a bizarre thing to say, considering he was already a huge star. And like Tony Joe was incredibly talented. It wasn't like he was like a pretty face with an accent or something like that. Like he was a great guitar player and a great singer songwriter too. So it's just a very funny, John maybe lacks social graces from time to time. I don't know how to
also
take that.
Actually that carries over, because Tony Joe White, even the way he would introduce Polk Salad Annie, was so charismatic and
totally
full of personality, which is exactly the opposite of John.
That is a great point. That John was not a big banterer on stage. I think that's fair to say. And from everything I've heard, Tony Joe just had this big Elvis kind of, like he could say anything and it would sound kind of authoritative and warm. And I don't
It
know
was
how
like,
much he's.
it was like, let me tell you a little story, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And again, not put on, like that's who he actually was. So it wasn't like he was up there, corn poning it or something. It was just like that's, genuinely, um, that's who he was. And yeah, I don't know if it was because he was Southern and had that, or just because he was charming. But yeah, I think you're right that John did have a. There was just no way for him to hold an audience in his palm like that when he wasn't playing. I think that's definitely true.
I wouldn't say it was my favorite, but it is in some ways, even though it's the silliest of their song, is It Came Out of the Sky,
It's a great
because
song. Yeah.
because it demonstrated not only that he was an incredible musician and he could have this comic side to him, but it was also intellectual. It had
Hmm.
incredible political references, as you talk about in the book. And it was
Hmm.
like, okay, how can you just throw this song out there talking about Ronald Reagan, Spiro Agnew? I
Hmm.
mean, and the Pope, and it was just every line had something that resonates still today as to what's happening right now, whether it's the economy, whether it's politics, whether it's civil discourse, whether it's power, you know?
I that is a great one to bring up, honestly, and not even one that jumps to my mind when I think of like my personal favorites, even though like just hearing you talk about it just now. Um, First of all, yeah, it is a great song. It's just like musically, it's very interesting, but it also really does embody like what that band was able to do so well. It's like musically, it sounds 10 years older than it was. Like it sounds from 1959 instead of 1969. So it's not like challenging. It's like you hear it on the radio and it'd be like immediately immediately familiar or comforting or however you want to describe it. And then it's like a story song about like some asteroid or whatever falling to the ground. And so it's like, but it's like a funny story song. You know what I mean? It's not like it's not like Ballad of the Green Berets or something that's like, oh, Sturm und Drang and like all this other stuff. It's very funny. It's lighthearted. It 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 sort of pokes fun while also very clearly and kind of ably showing like how paranoia sets in and like how different political actors take advantage of that situation and how people use things to further their own kind of nefarious schemes. And again, you don't even have to think about it in those terms, but it's just like it's a perfect example of what Credence did, which was to like reflect the time period in a way that was as serious or as deep as you wanted it to be,
It's
while at the
funny.
same time while at the same time allowing it to just be a lark and a fun dance song if that's all you wanted to get from it.
You know how you can tell if a band is really great is that we're talking about this and now both of us want to listen to the song.
Oh, it's great. Yeah, I'll probably listen to it right after, and that's again, that was Willie and the Poor Boys, right? So that was like, later late in the year, of this unbelievable productive time period that he was having. And
One
yeah,
year.
and again, not even a single, like not even like a song that was like made an impact. It was like an album cut. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's this that's perfectly encapsulates, I really think, what people were able to get from them, which was just like,
And the thing is, like, yeah, it's like this Annus Mirabilis, whatever Einstein's 1905 was, because there's
mhm,
3 albums in 1 year. But like, it's like, okay, the longest song, and they only give you 10, just like you were saying, they play 10 songs, they're off. They give you 10 songs in an album when everyone else gives you 12.
yeah,
And, but if you look at the longest song, which is Effigy, all these people go out there saying he's a fatalist and a pessimist and stuff like that. Up
mhm,
Around the Bend is not a fatalistic song. I'm sorry, but Effigy really is a deep song. And I mean,
mhm.
again, like, and you were saying, for a young person, which is what he was at the time, that's a really heartfelt, deep thought out song.
Yeah, he specifically, in interviews at the time, specifically dedicated it to Richard Nixon. And it's kind of like the opposite version of this. It's like, okay, you buy this album because you want to hear the hits on it, and the hits on Willie and the Poor Boys are like Down on the Corner. You got that one. But like, yeah, the deep cuts on that are incredible, between that and Effigy. Effigy, Came Out of the Sky, Feeling Blue is on that record too. It's a really remarkable just sort of like emotional statement, that whole record, because again, like without ever really getting into like a cliched feeling, they showcase an incredibly wide number.
I'm glad I pulled this one out, because Fortunate Son, Down in the Corner, it's the Midnight Special, which wasn't the greatest song, but it was just like Heard It Through the Grape, not Heard It Through the Grapevine, Proud Mary. Oh yeah. Before we get to Proud Mary, what was I gonna say?
And they got Cotton Fields on here. They got
that's what I was gonna talk. Cotton Fields. So my mom was in the home. She was 95 years old. She sang every day. We sang Creedence. We sang Johnny Cash. That was cool when he met Johnny Cash too. But we would sing Cotton Fields, and all the people who worked in the place were Black. And my brother goes, "You can't sing Cotton Fields in this place." And I realized that was the beginning of my understanding of cancel culture, because there's really nothing wrong with singing Cotton Fields. But then,
it was a Lead Belly song, sure. Yeah,
I know. Yeah, but you can't. Yeah, it's I'm culturally appropriating Lead Belly.
Maybe, song. I don't know. I don't know how anyone would take that, but yeah, it's just it's an incredible. That record just it's a pretty wild run of, again, without any easy things there. It's all pretty heavy, but musically quite amazing and very fun. But to go from Came Out of the Sky to Feeling Blue to Fortunate Son to Effigy, that's a roller coaster for sure.
Well, the thing about it is that you talk about, and very well put, because I thought the same thing, Fortunate Son is what it is, but then the fact that whether it's in, I don't know, Apocalypse Now maybe, or wherever it is, that it was adopted by an entire army, literally and figuratively, as an anthem, an anti-war anthem. But he didn't really mean it that way when he wrote it.
It's a perfect example of a song that is popular and beloved because the emotional substance of it is so well communicated. It's like the feeling of that song in the guitar, in the vocals, in the whole band performance. It's like a really heavy, emotionally in your face kind of song. And so everybody kind of feels riled by it in some way. But if you read it, pay attention to it, it's not as easy to pin down as you might think, because we get a kind of Pavlovian response to that song, whoever you are. But as you say, it could be used and was used in the context of anti-war demonstrations. It could be used in the context of men fighting in country to prepare themselves for battle. And I'm aware that those two things are not necessarily, they're not, in competition with one another. Those can be complementary feelings or whatever. But it's not an expressly anti-war song. It's a song about class. It's a song about, I have to go to the singer of that song. The speaker there is not saying, it's wrong that I have to go to war. They're saying it's wrong that I have to go to war and richer people don't. Like, that's the message of it. And like, that is, and you could make the argument that that is in fact in itself an anti-war message, because that's been a component of every war ever fought. But just going by the words itself, like, it can mean a lot of different things. It's open to more interpretations than we might even realize. And it can be as complex as you need it to be, while at the same time still, like I said, just as a little bit of pop music emotional communication. It's just it's unbelievable. Everything about it is just designed to hit you right in the chest, and it does it so well.
Something reminds me of, oh yeah, again, because when you listen at the Royal Albert Hall, they play it too fast. The tempo is too fast in it.
They
But
took a lot of things very fast.
yeah, and
at
he
that
didn't
concert
like
and
that
others.
performance, which reminds me, we talk about his knee-jerk responses and fighting for principle, whether it's encores or not playing his own music. The other
Mhm.
thing is the Woodstock performance, and he tells long stories about that, but he didn't want it on the album. He didn't want it there, which probably hurt their career. But
I
nonetheless,
mean, yeah, you got to assume. I mean, Sly and the Family, like a perfect example is that, I mean, by the time of Woodstock, they were already very, very, very like pop music famous. They had already had multiple charting songs and had been on television. So they weren't in quite the same position as their fellow San Francisco groups, Santana and Sly and the Family Stone. But that movie took both of those groups to like a different level of fame, is my understanding, because it was just like um, as movie stars and as sort of cinematic events, those performances were unreal. That Michael Shreve performance for the Santana band, and then obviously the whole "Want to Take You Higher" sequence, like from Sly and the Family Stone, is just like an astounding thing to watch. And having seen the footage of them at Woodstock, there's nothing quite to that level, just as a documentary subject for them. But I mean, it's great footage, and they look cool as hell, and they sound terrific. Like it's hard to imagine anybody would have watched that and somehow gone like, oh, well, I don't like them anymore. It's like, no, it's just super up close, well shot footage of them just like absolutely shredding. And there were multiple people at that concert, other musicians, who said that they were unbelievable that night, and every night on either side of them. I never heard anyone complain or read anybody complain about a Creedence Clearwater Revival show, especially, except for no encores. I never heard anybody say they were pretty bland tonight, until maybe they were back to the trio setting in 71.
Yeah, I never would have thought of that, and then it brought back the concert and me being really pissed off. So I'm the perfect example, because this was not the only other one I saw, which was great. That same year was the only tour they ever made was Blind Faith, and they only had like 6 songs,
right?
And then Traffic and Cream, and then they had to leave, so there wasn't any encore. But that was understandable. But that was really cool that I got to see them. I forgot all about that too. But yeah, it was like everyone was clapping and clapping. Your hands get really tired of clapping, and then it's like Elvis has left the building.
Right. Yeah, it's just such a strange thing, because it's like, yeah, I understand if you have it built into your set, like, okay, no matter what, we leave the stage for 5 minutes, then we come back and we play an encore.
It doesn't hurt anybody. It doesn't hurt.
First of all, even that doesn't hurt anybody, like you say. But then, like, by all accounts, people were losing their minds clapping for these guys. It wasn't, it's like they were literally begging for encores. That
Especially
seems
in England, in London.
Yeah, that seems like a reasonable time to pull out the encores, regardless of your feelings about it. But again, it would appear that even John Fogerty regrets that at this point in his life.
They could have done a cover of 1,000 different songs that he loved. They didn't even have to do one of theirs, and that would have been the way to do it.
They could have played Proud Mary again, and no one would have. You know what I mean? Like, who would have been disappointed by this?
But they could play In the Midnight Hour. I mean,
exactly, anything. Yeah, I mean, they used to fill 5-hour sets a night before they were famous. Like, these guys knew how to get people moving, and if you already have 15,000 people screaming for you, it seems like that's a pretty easy one. But yeah, not for me to say. Yeah, that one, there are some people still not over it, that's for sure.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't have thought of it. You got me all pissed off again. Well, so in conclusion, I guess, oh, one thing I didn't ask you was, obviously I'm holding this up. You need to hold your book up.
Yeah, so here is A Song for Everyone, the story of Creedence Clearwater Revival.
How'd you pick the cover photo?
Oh, well, the cover photo was picked by our designers, but I thought that they did a wonderful job. I just, if I could break it down a little bit, what I think is really great is that you get the four guys, but it's not like a famous photo of them. You get the sort of natural thing with the flowers, which was like, kind of fits them for how they weren't like flower power, but they were sort of like a rootsy kind of thing. They had a lot more sort of like nature iconography, and then none of them are looking at each other. They're all sort of focused their own way. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of the better pictures of him. First of all, because John fixed his stupid ass hairdo and turned it, just covers his forehead, and the rest of them don't look as goofy as they usually look.
Yeah, they all look great. And then we picked out the inside photos are definitely ones that I picked.
Oh yeah, they're great. I forgot to say that. They're really good.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we got a lot of different ones, including like here's them at an early age as the Gollywogs, which they was an early iteration. Yeah, kind of a racist name, and before they were able to change it, and yeah, so there's in my opinion, it's a great book, and you should buy a copy. So
that's the reason why I said it about the cover. I mean, yeah, because look, I own a bookstore, and I say this in every interview, but you're supposed to know, the saying, don't judge a book by its cover. But every single person who comes into my bookstore judges every book by its cover.
I mean, yeah, it shouldn't be your final judgment, but we all judge a book's cover. So,
it's the first thing, unless you're looking for something specifically, it's the first thing you look at, and you pick it up. That's the key, is picking it up.
Well, so my favorite thing about this cover is actually on the back, because Creedence is obviously famous for having released 3 albums in 1969 alone. So that's a big deal. But in a footnote here, I do make sure to give some credit. There is another band who also released 3 albums in 1969, and that was the UK's Fairport Convention, released 3 albums that same year. And it just so happens that one of the blurbs we got for this book was from
Richard Thompson.
So, I mean, Richard is a heroic musical figure, so that's just a kind of mind-blowing thing to me anyway. But
I know, he picks up on things. I've seen him several times, and he always picks on some American conceit that you wouldn't have thought that he would know about. And Sandy Denny and that song Legion Leaf and Matty Groves, all that stuff was like
amazing stuff. Yeah,
it was all in my wheelhouse.
Yeah,
but we could go on for hours. Like, I'm not gonna. Yeah, we're already into this for like an hour and change. But,
I know.
But thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for writing the book. And and I think for people of a certain age, as they say, it really brings back memories, and really fond memories. And I think for kids, it introduces them, in many cases, to something that they're going to pick up, and like you and I, after the interview, are going to play the records. So,
well, that's especially talking on behalf of people who lived through that era and saw that band, and as it was happening. Hearing that it rings true is the best compliment, because obviously that's just what I tried to do with this, and tried to sort of introduce this era through these 4 guys and make it seem fresh to people who weren't there, or maybe alive again for people who were. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Sure. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Yeah. Thank you again.
See ya.